So if you will go up to File, Open, and in the High Pass Sharpening folder, there is a special folder called Becker High Pass. I'm going to open it. And here is the PDF, which I gave this morning, but which is available if you ask for these materials sent to you later. Here's the image we're using. And I have, in today's lesson, given a folder where I compare different methods of sharpening so you can see the same image sharpened by different methods. We're not going to look at those in class, but I encourage you to bring up both 2 or 3 images, whatever are there in the comparison folders, and size them so they're side by side on the screen, and look at the difference in the results and decide if there's a way you prefer. So for today, click Larry Becker High Pass JPEG. Make sure it is in fact a format of a JPEG, and then open it. It should open in the editor. And Larry recommends this methodology when you're working with architectural images, where there is a lot of detail. You can see in this picture, we have all those sections in the back wall. We have all of these railing details. We have the bits of water detail. There's just a lot of things that could affect to be sharpened, but there are also smooth areas to be avoided. Look at the wall of water. There's obviously some texture there, but if we're going to enjoy the architecture, we don't want everything to be sharpened. And so what's nice about Larry's is it removes smooth areas from the effect. Otherwise, he still uses the high pass filter. So let's start like we did and make a copy of the background. Command or Control J, or Layer, Duplicate Layer. Either will do it. Let's click twice on the name, and let's change it to High Pass Becker. Well, Necker won't do it, will it? Okay, that just tells me if I open this file, the work I did on this layer was Becker's version of high pass. So we have made that high pass extra layer. We're now going to apply that high pass filter, which is in the View menu. So it's, no, sorry, it's in the Filter menu. Other, High Pass, just as we did in the other one. And what you're thinking of here is the setting for the pixels is to highlight the detail you want to sharpen without highlighting the areas that should not be sharpened. So if you play around with the radius, if you get too high, you see all the detail that's in that, you don't want to sharpen it all. So you come down, and I need to remind you that in any of these sharpening windows, the number will partly depend upon the size of the file you're using. These are low resolution files. If you had a high resolution file, you might need to dial a slightly higher radius. But what you're doing is looking at the image and saying, does that bring out the part that I want to accentuate? You can see how it changes. And so I'm not sure exactly which one we're going to use on this, or he used. You can read it in the tutorial. I think it probably could afford to be somewhere around 4. No, that's too much. We'll come down closer to 3. Okay. So the idea is you want to be sure you see in that image the detail that needs to be sharpened, and that the areas to be smooth are not highlighted. We will reduce them in any event, but they don't need to be highlighted. So once I've chosen the number I think works for the image I'm using, I click OK. Now, we're going to input in 3 different effects before we change to that overview, to the blend mode. We're going to get the color out of this layer. Any color that's still in this high pass layer, he feels detracts from highlighting detail. So we're going to not make a separate layer. We simply want to change this filter with a few extra changes. If you go to Control on Windows or Command on Mac and type the U, you'll get the Hue and Saturation Adjustment layer. And we're going to take the saturation of the master channel and turn it all the way down. Now we're not desaturating the original image. We're simply desaturating the filter and say, okay. He then wants to accentuate the contrast that's showing up in this filter that's going to be sharpened. So he tells us, take your Control in Windows, your Command in Mac, and type in L for levels. And you will get the levels adjustment layer, but it's going to be applied directly onto the filter layer there. And he tells you what you need to do is bring the ends in toward the pixels and bring it on both sides until the center point is still under the middle of the peak. So you might have to work back and forth. And if you stop at the point that you begin to see pixels, you will have a less of an effect. If you want a heightened effect on something, you bring it in more, you're going to accentuate that eventual sharpness. So my general feeling is come to about where these pixels begin, but be sure you've brought them in to the point where you think that this is centered under the spike. And once you've done that, you say, okay. And the third thing we're going to do is blur the surface areas that are not contrasty, that we don't want to sharpen. So to do this on the same layer, we're going to go to the filter menu and we're going to come down to blur. We're going to move over to the adjacent menu and come down to surface blur. So it's filter, blur, surface blur, and click it. And I'm going to refer to his numbers just to be sure we use it on this image the way he thought. He suggests that the radius be about 2 pixels. And remember, I think we have a smaller file than he originally used, so 2 or 3 pixels is fine. And he recommends a threshold of about 15. In this case, the threshold limits where the blurring will occur. So if you look at the inset here, where you see some of the smooth area where the water flows, play with the threshold, get rid of it. And notice that some of this is getting to the water flowing here. When I raise it, it blurs out that area. If I go too far, it blurs up everything. So the trick is to get the point on the threshold setting where it leaves the detail sharp, but it smooths out the areas that should not have sharpness on them. And I think, this is not staying where I want it to stay. He suggested, I think, around 15. So I'm going to use somewhere near what he said was the right. But again, you can understand, if you understand the reason for it, you can figure what's best on your image. You look to say which setting and threshold will not affect the sharp areas, but will bring the blur simply to the smooth areas where I want it. And when you're satisfied, you say, okay. And now you're ready to perform the magic. You go to the normal blend mode. To the strongest effect, go to overlay. And to see the before and after, knock out that layer's eyeball and bring it back. Now, if you think you overdid it, you have 2 choices here. Overlay is the strongest effect. Right under it in the blend modes is soft light. Try that. That's a little gentler. That might solve it for you. But if you still wanted to reduce it, you would go to opacity. But remember that if you need the strong effect, you want overlay. If you want less of an effect, try soft light. And if you still need to come down, you can use the opacity slider. So let's look at this image before and after this layer. So hide the top layer. There's the way the image appeared. Now we look at it, we think, gee, that's not very sharp. But actually, that image was pretty sharp when it was taken. What we've done is accentuated the fine lines or details. And if that's too much, then you change from overlay to soft light. And if you want something in between those two, go back to overlay and reduce the opacity a little bit. and you can find any degree of sharpness that seems right for your image. So I'd encourage you to think about this as something to use on architecture. It can be used on any image, but he recommends it where you have a lot of fine detail. And boy, architecture has so many lines that make that architecture, that if you use it on that, you will accentuate those details and you won't mess up the smooth. Look how nice that water is. It still looks smooth and even. So this is Larry Becker's version of high pass sharpening.